August 26, 1944. Washington, D.C. The humidity hangs heavy over the Potomac, a thick, suffocating blanket that clings to the white marble of the Capitol's monuments. It is a Saturday morning. The city is waking up. To the people walking the streets, the war is something distant. It is a headline in the Washington Post. It is a newsreel playing in a dark theater. It is a telegram from the War Department that neighbors dread. But it is over there, across an ocean, thousands of miles away in the hedgerows of France or the islands of the Pacific. Here, on American soil, there is safety. There is the absolute, unshakable belief that the fortress of America is untouchable. They are wrong. High above the cloud layer, invisible to the naked eye, a mechanical predator is stalking the Capitol. It is not a bird. It is not an American transport plane. It is a silver ghost, a Messerschmitt Me 264, the Amerikabomber. Its engines are throbbing with a low, dissonant hum that does not belong in these skies. Inside the pressurized cockpit, 4 men are pushing the limits of human endurance and mechanical engineering. They have flown for 20 hours, skimming the waves of the Atlantic, dodging the radar nets, running on fumes and fanaticism. They are not here to invade. They are here to deliver a message. But what history books fail to mention, what the archives usually don't show, is the terrifying fragility of that moment. We think of the United States as invincible, but on that morning, the only thing standing between the President of the United States and a 2,000-pound bomb was a layer of clouds and a gust of wind. This is the story of the day the war came home, the day the Nazi leadership made the fatal mistake of poking the sleeping giant in its own lair. They hoped to break American morale. Instead, they unleashed a wrath so complete, so totally devastating, that it would reshape the very definition of destruction. Before we go deeper, let me ask you something. If you're holding your phone right now or watching this on your screen, have you subscribed yet? If you haven't, do it now. Subscribe to World War II Stunned.
The mission had begun in silence. Norway, the Stavanger airfield, a runway extended specifically for this monster. The Me 264 was a marvel of desperation. It was sleek, with a wingspan that seemed to stretch for miles, loaded down with so much fuel that the tires bulged and threatened to burst on the tarmac. The pilot, Captain Hans Volkers, knew the odds. The Luftwaffe was dying. The Allies were pushing from the west. The Soviets were grinding from the east. Germany needed a miracle. They needed to prove that they could still bite. They needed to strike the heart of the enemy. The flight plan was a suicide note, across the North Sea, up towards the Arctic Circle to avoid the British fighters, then a long, lonely arc down the coast of North America. They were flying blind for hours. Radio silence was absolute. One stray transmission would alert the massive listening ears of the Allied intelligence network. They were ghosts. The crew lived on stimulants and fear. The vibration of the 4 BMW engines was the only constant, a rattling reminder that they were suspending tons of metal and explosives over a dark, unforgiving ocean. As they approached the American coast, the reality of the American industrial machine became visible, even from 30,000 feet. The ocean was not empty, it was crawling. Convoys, endless lines of Liberty ships, destroyers, escort carriers. To the German pilots, used to the starving resources of the Reich, it was a terrifying sight. The ocean was paved with American steel. They saw the rich warrior in action before they even reached land. The Americans didn't just build ships, they printed them. The sheer volume of traffic forced Volkers to climb higher, straining the engines, burning precious fuel. They had to stay invisible. They crossed the coastline near Delaware. No sirens, no flak. The American Air Defense Network was looking outward, scanning for fleets, not a single lonely needle in a haystack. The audacity of the plan was its armor. Who would be crazy enough to fly a bomber across the Atlantic? The Germans flew over towns that were glowing with light. No blackouts. In Europe, a single light could get you killed. Here, America blazed with electricity. It was a slap in the face to the darkened cities of the Reich. It was a display of arrogance. It was a display of unlimited power. Volkers checked his map. The Potomac River wound like a silver snake below them, reflecting the moonlight. They were close. The target was not a factory. It was not a shipyard. It was symbolic. The White House. The goal was to drop a single heavy bomb on the executive mansion. Kill the president? Maybe. But the real goal was fear, to show the American cowboy that his ranch was burning, to prove that the Atlantic Ocean was no longer a shield. The bomb bay doors groaned open. The cold air of the high altitude rushed into the fuselage. The bombardier peered through the scope. The distinct geometry of Washington, D.C. came into focus, the layout of the streets, the mall, the Capitol building, and there, the White House. It looked like a toy, a dollhouse. The lever was pulled. The aircraft lurched upwards, relieved of the deadly weight. The bomb fell. It tumbled through the humid air, a dark teardrop whistling toward the seat of American power. The crew didn't wait to see the impact. Volkers banked the plane hard, turning back towards the sea, towards a rendezvous with a U-boat that might not even be there. They had done their job. They had delivered the insult.
The explosion shattered the morning calm like a hammer hitting a pane of glass. The bomb missed the White House by 300 yards. It detonated in Lafayette Square. The shockwave blew out the windows of the executive mansion. It stripped the leaves off the trees. It carved a crater into the manicured park. A plume of smoke and dirt rose high into the humid air, visible for miles. The sound was deafening, a crack of thunder that didn't roll but snapped. Inside the White House, the Secret Service moved with violent efficiency. President Roosevelt was secured, moved to the bunker. The confusion was absolute. Was it sabotage? A bomb planted by a spy? A gas main explosion? Then came the reports from the observers. The sound of engines fading to the east. The distinct shape seen by a spotter on a rooftop. A plane. A bomber. The realization hit the American military command like a physical blow. We have been bombed. From the air. The initial reaction in the streets of D.C. was panic. People ran, cars crashed. The illusion of safety had evaporated in a split second. But that panic lasted exactly 1 hour. It was replaced by something else, something colder, something harder. In the Pentagon, the mood shifted from shock to a terrifying, calculated rage. General Marshall, the architect of victory, stood before a map of the world. The room was silent. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of coffee. The reports were coming in. Radar had picked up the Ghost on its way out. It was a German design. They knew. The United States of America was not a nation that took insults lightly. But more than that, the United States was a nation of unlimited resources. The rich warrior had been slapped, and the rich warrior was about to take off the gloves. In Germany, the propaganda machine went wild. Goebbels announced that Washington was in flames, that the American government had fled, that the great fortress had been breached. They celebrated. They thought they had struck a blow for morale. They thought the Americans would demand peace to protect their homes. They didn't understand Americans. They didn't understand that they had just removed the only thing keeping the U.S. military from total, unadulterated annihilation tactics: restraint. The order came down from the highest levels. It wasn't just about winning the war anymore. It was about erasure. The concept of strategic bombing was about to be redefined. The U.S. economy, which was already outproducing the world, shifted gears. The production lines in Detroit, in California, in Seattle, they didn't just speed up, they went frantic. The workers weren't just building planes for the war effort anymore. They were building planes for revenge. The quota for B-29 superfortresses was doubled, then tripled. The Manhattan Project, operating in secret, was given a blank check. Whatever they needed, copper, uranium, gold, manpower, take it. Just get it done.
The hunt for the single bomber that had escaped was the first display of this new American temper. The U.S. Navy didn't send a destroyer. They sent 2 entire carrier battle groups to sweep the Atlantic. They treated the ocean like a swimming pool, gridding it off, searching every wave. The cost didn't matter. Fuel was irrelevant. The pilot, Volkers, never made his rendezvous. His plane was intercepted 300 miles off the coast. He wasn't shot down in a dogfight. He was swarmed. 12 American fighters descended on the lone bomber. They tore it to shreds with .50 caliber machine gun fire. It was overkill. It was wasteful. And that was the point.
The retaliation began not with a battle, but with a shadow. 6 weeks after the Washington bomb, the sky over Germany darkened. It wasn't a storm. It was aluminum. The United States Air Forces launched Operation Thunderclap, but this wasn't the thunderclap of history. This was a monster born of rage. 3,000 bombers, B-17s, B-24s, and the new shiny B-29s that had been diverted from the Pacific Theater. They flew in a formation so dense that it blotted out the sun. The escort fighters, the P-51 Mustangs, were not tethered to the bombers anymore. They were given a new order: clear the sky. They roamed ahead, hunting down anything with a Luftwaffe cross. They strafed airfields, trains, anything that moved. The Luftwaffe, already weak, was suffocated. The German jets, the Me 262s, rose to fight, technology against numbers. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every German jet, there were 20 American Mustangs. It didn't matter if the German plane was faster. It ran out of fuel. It ran out of ammo. The Americans had endless fuel. They had endless ammo. The bombers reached the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Germany. The target selection had changed. Before, they aimed for ball bearing factories, oil refineries, specific strategic targets. Now, the target was the grid square. The bomb bay doors opened. It wasn't precision bombing. It was saturation. Thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries rained down. The earth shook. The firestorms that were created didn't just burn buildings. They sucked the oxygen out of the air. They created weather systems of their own. The German leadership watched in horror. They had hoped to scare the Americans. Instead, they had invited a natural disaster made of metal and fire. The rich warrior was spending money at a rate that was incomprehensible to the bankrupt Nazi regime. The U.S. was dropping bombs that cost more than entire German neighborhoods. They were burning fuel that could have powered the Wehrmacht for a year just to fly a single mission. And they did it again the next day and the next. The logistical chain of the United States became a weapon in itself. Ships arrived in England every hour, mountains of crates, millions of gallons of aviation gas. There was no rationing for the military. If a tank broke down, they didn't fix it. They pushed it into a ditch and unloaded a new one. This terrified the German soldiers on the ground. They were fighting men who treated machines like disposable tissues. General Patton, commanding the Third Army, was given the leash he had always wanted. Go, he was told. Don't stop. He drove his tanks with a ferocity that bordered on madness. His supply lines were solid steel. He had air cover that was so total, German soldiers couldn't use the bathroom during the day without getting strafed. The American ground forces weren't just liberating, they were consuming territory. They moved with the confidence of men who knew that behind them stood the greatest industrial power in human history, now fully awake and incredibly angry.
By the winter of 1944, Germany was not losing. It was dissolving. Berlin was a moonscape. The raids had not stopped. The Amerikabomber incident had removed any political opposition in the U.S. to harsh measures. There were no voices calling for mercy. The image of the crater in Lafayette Square was printed in every newspaper. It was the fuel that kept the furnaces burning. The end came not with a negotiation, but with a collapse. The Wehrmacht simply ran out of existence. They didn't have bullets, they didn't have food, they didn't have fuel. On the other side of the line, the American GI sat eating fresh eggs, drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, backed by a wall of artillery that could level a mountain. The final push into Germany was a race, but unlike the history we know, where the Soviets took Berlin, the enraged American giant moved faster. Eisenhower, usually cautious, was driven by the pressure from Washington. "Take it all," the orders said. American tanks rolled into the suburbs of Berlin while the Red Army was still fighting on the Seelow Heights. The encounter was brutal. The SS units that remained fought with the desperation of the damned, but they were met with flamethrowers and white phosphorus. The U.S. Army didn't clear buildings, they leveled them. The preservation of infrastructure was no longer a priority. The priority was to ensure that no plane would ever fly from this soil to threaten America again. When the American forces reached the Reich Chancellery, it was a hollow shell. The Nazi leadership, the men who had ordered the strike on Washington, had taken the coward's way out. They had underestimated the equation of war. They thought war was about will. They forgot that war is also about physics and economics. You cannot fight a nation that can replace a lost bomber in an hour when it takes you a month. The Amerikabomber what if of this story ends in a chilling silence. The war in Europe ended months earlier than in our timeline, but the cost was higher. The destruction of Germany was total. The rebuilding would take decades longer. The relationship between the U.S. and the world had changed. America had learned a dark lesson. It learned that its oceans were not moats. It learned that in the modern world, safety is a myth. And it decided, in that smoke-filled winter of 1944, that the only defense was absolute, overwhelming offense. The Amerikabomber was a tactical success for Germany. It hit its target area. It caused panic. But strategically, it was the worst mistake in military history. It took a conflict that the United States viewed as a job to be done and turned it into a crusade. It transformed the arsenal of democracy into the forge of vengeance. The crater in Lafayette Square was eventually filled in. Grass grew back, but the scar remained on the American psyche. It was the reminder that birthed the superpowers. It was the moment the giant stopped sleeping and started watching the sky with a loaded gun in its hand, daring anyone to make a move. So the next time you look at the history of World War II, remember this. It wasn't just about the battles won. It was about the restraint shown. Because if that single German bomber had truly succeeded, if that bomb had fallen a few hundred yards closer, the map of Europe wouldn't just look different today. It might have been empty.